Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining this discussion. It's the place of therapeutics in future pandemics, and it's being hosted by the Coming Global Centre for Pandemic Therapeutics at the Doherty Institute of Immunity and Infection in Melbourne, Australia. I am Victoria MacDonald, and I am the Health and Social Care Editor for Channel 4 News in the UK. And I am joined by an illustrious panel of speakers to discuss an issue that has gone underreported, has, I suppose, in many ways been the poor cousin to the attention paid to vaccines in the pandemic. Now, overarching this discussion is another pandemic. We don't know what it will be, where it will come from, how it will behave, but there are many lessons learned from COVID and an agreement that those lessons have to be harnessed, and that work has to start now. We know the World Health Assembly is meeting next week, and the WHO has set itself a deadline of this month for negotiations to succeed around an inaugural pandemic accord, and we will be discussing that with our panelists. I suppose much of the debate, especially around access, has been about vaccines. We also know that significantly more money has been put into vaccine development compared with therapeutics, and yet the experience from HIV and COVID-19 was that therapeutics are critically important to the response to a major global pandemic. New treatment platforms offer the potential to protect the world from future pandemics, and without them, the next pandemic could be an even greater threat to people and society. But much of the technology is slow and old, and it can take 2 to 5 years just to reach phase 1 trials. Many of you on here will know that. And while highly effective, monoclonal antibodies were developed relatively quickly in response to COVID. They were expensive and difficult to deploy at scale and lost effectiveness with new variants. I think we'll be picking some of that up later. Paxlovid and molnupiravir were approved late in 2021, more than a year after the first approval for a vaccine, and were again expensive and largely only available in high-income countries. So that is what this discussion will center around: the role in a pandemic, the place in a pandemic, response and managing infection, impacting the duration and severity of the disease. You will hear much more about this from Sharon Lewin, who is the director of the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity and the director of the Coming Global Centre for Pandemic Therapeutics based at the Institute. And just by way of background, the Coming Global Centre for Pandemic Therapeutics is a mission-driven, globally connected research program that will enable rapid design and development of treatments for pathogens of pandemic potential. Sharon will tell you much more about that. So you are welcome to this virtual panel. It would be nice to see you all, but in this modern age. Before we begin, a bit of housekeeping. So this event is being attended by both media representatives and invited stakeholders. However, questions to the panelists once they have all spoken briefly will be prioritized for journalists. And for the journalists attending, you can ask questions either through the chat or raising your hand. If you'd like to ask the question verbally, please state your name and media outlet and who you would like to address the question to. Our panelists are also available to speak one-to-one with journalists after the event has ended. So please contact the communications team on the numbers listed on the media advisory. So with that, let's begin. Michelle Kazatchkine, a former member of the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness, is Response and Senior Fellow with the Global Health Centre of the Graduate Institute for International and Development Studies in Geneva. Michelle, welcome. Over to you. Michelle, you're on mute.
Thank you, Victoria. Apologies, I was on mute. And good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Let me make 4 short points to start this discussion today. The first one is that the COVID pandemic has clearly shown us, I would say again shown us, that technological advance does not by itself lead to equitable access. And so in May 2021, at the time when the independent panel first reported to the World Health Assembly, we recommended that truly transformative changes are made to the international pandemic preparedness and response ecosystem with regard to research and development, clinical trials, manufacturing and delivery of vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics. Equal weight was given to vaccines, diagnostics, and therapies. The panel called for approaching medical countermeasures for pandemics as resources managed collectively for public health benefit. We call it global common goods. And without going into too much detail, let me say that that package included proposing that platforms are pre-positioned at regional level or sub-regional level across the world, platforms of R&D, similar to the mRNA R&D hub in South Africa that many of you would know, together with manufacturing capacity, independent clinical trial networks, and that there are new modalities of funding of industry by the public system that would condition support on sharing of intellectual property and manufacturing technologies. You will remember also that the panel recommended the adoption of a pandemic framework convention. At that time, we said within the next 6 months. That was based on the time needed after the Chernobyl catastrophe to negotiate an accord on nuclear safety, using what's the powers of the WHO Constitution under Article 19. My second point is that the pandemic accord currently negotiated in Geneva, and as it stands today, as we speak, will not deliver on such reforms. And despite equity being agreed as a sort of guiding norm for these negotiations, the core challenges of the negotiations have been and still are access to pathogens and benefits sharing, intellectual property, freedom to operate in research and development, and conditions for technology transfer, the financing of preparedness, and the governance. So my third point is that in this context, I can only reiterate my full support, and I would like to say the full support of the independent panel and its co-chairs, Helen Clark and Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, to today's call for a greatly increased focus on therapies in pandemic preparedness, in addition to the effort on vaccines that we hear so much about. Both Ebola and COVID-19 have witnessed profound inequalities in access to available therapies, when both treatment and vaccines are actually needed so that the people are treated and so the transmission is prevented. As a result, we should be able to stop infectious outbreaks and prevent them from becoming epidemics and pandemics. And the other concept that I feel is very important is that both treatment and vaccines, and of course diagnostics, need to be available where and when infectious outbreaks occur. My fourth point, and that's a bit of my own bias, is that monoclonal antibodies are among the particularly promising therapies of the future in this regard. They've intensively researched and now increasingly used in infectious diseases from RSV to malaria and HIV. And as was put in your media briefing, the first neutralizing therapeutic monoclonal antibodies to SARS-CoV-2, Regeneron, have been developed within 8 months in 2020. They have been mostly used as a therapeutic tool, to some extent as prophylaxis, but almost exclusively in the US. And that is because they were funded by BARDA, the US agency that would fund the development of product in the US for the use and the safety of US citizens. And they were, of course, at very high cost, $2,500 or $3,000 per treatment. They were highly effective, but highly effective for the first circulating strains of the virus, and they lost efficacy on the Omicron family. But since then, new technological progress has just been remarkable. We have now new platforms that have been designed that allow for the rapid selection of antibodies with selective desired neutralizing capacity. Molecular engineering further allows now to build multi-specific antibodies that can reach different epitopes, which increase the potency of the antibodies and decreases the risk of escape. And so multi-specific antibodies with neutralizing capacity to all main circulating variants of SARS-CoV-2 are currently being developed. And one can easily envisage, and that's my final point, that these remarkably agile technologies could be part of future pre-positioned platforms for pandemic preparedness. These platforms could prepare genetic antibody libraries to all kinds of pathogens relevant for pandemic preparedness, perform a preclinical selection to get some best clinical candidate molecules and save at least 10 to 12 months of work so that the status of IND, investigational new drug, could be ready somewhere within 6 months where needed. And there's no reason why tech transfer for GMP production of such molecules couldn't be possible, at least in theory. But of course, under the conditions where we are today, given where we are with the negotiations in Geneva, that is not what can happen now. This will certainly be among one of our key messages of the panel next report, which we expect to release in 3-4 weeks from now. Over to you, Victoria.
Thank you, Michelle. That opens up a whole number of questions already, which is exactly what we wanted from this panel. Can I move swiftly on so that there is lots of time for questions at the end? And actually, I forgot to mention that the session is being recorded and it is on the record. Can I introduce Eloise Todd, who is Executive Director and co-founder of the Pandemic Action Network, and she's going to be talking about lessons learned from COVID-19, the response and ACT Accelerator, and we'll be talking about next steps for advancing equity and access to therapeutics. Thank you, Eloise.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. So what can we learn from what happened during COVID-19? At the outset of the pandemic, as early as April, May 2020, a group of international leaders came together and had some energy and inspiration to form something they called the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator, a well-meaning effort to deliver tests, treatments, vaccines, and other PPE and health support to low and middle income countries. A very noble objective. Unfortunately, while some great things happened via ACT, and it's important to recognize the vast amounts of money raised and deployed on all areas, but particularly for vaccines, of course, great things were done. But unfortunately, the setup wasn't particularly good for timely delivery of any of the tools, and it was particularly badly set up for therapeutics. So why was that? One of the problems with that approach was it was a very loosely governed coming together of different entities that, while they had the best interests of delivering at heart, actually pitted each of the fundraising areas against each other. So 4 pillars were formed: one for vaccines, one for therapeutics, one for diagnostics, and one for something called the health systems connector. And very early on, some of us in civil society were giving some advice from the outside saying, unless you have a single fundraising strategy here, unless you have a fundraising strategy and a single entity that's actually going to spend against an epidemiological strategy that is about what do we need to do on all of these different areas, you're essentially setting up a competition between those forces. The end result of that by September 2021, the vaccines pillar had achieved 95% of its fundraising target, and the therapeutics pillar just 19%. There are some features of therapeutics which meant that was a bit of a hard one a bit of reasons why therapeutics didn't fare quite as well as vaccines. There was a particularly loose alliance of organizations there, and this is all documented in some of the official ACT-A lessons learned documents and reviews. But it does come back to that underfunding and some of the pieces of the therapeutics solutions box being quite expensive. There were equity issues as well. So the first lesson I would say is that ACT-A was not particularly well set up for therapeutics and did not have a unified fundraising strategy that was really end to end. It focused very much on fundraising and procurement, and the R&D piece and the delivery piece were also left lacking. Another key takeaway, my second point, is that generic efforts came too late. So there were some attempts to work through the medicines patent pool. And again, it's easy to slate what happened during the crisis, but the fact that these partnerships came in January 2022 and March 2022 to produce generic versions of molnupiravir and indeed nirmatrelvir, a part of the Paxlovid family, just came really quite too late in the process to have an impact in low and middle income countries. And I do think as well, there was a communications spotlight and juggernaut that was the vaccines gold rush. And we saw leaders trying to invest in the solution. And really, the whole management of COVID was lost in that gold rush approach. So rather than understanding that even if we get to a vaccine solution quickly, of course, even if a vaccine would come in 6 months or a year, it might not actually stop transmission completely, which is what happened. But it does mean that you have several months or years in which you have to find where people are ill and treat them to save lives. And that whole narrative was lost. And I do think there's actually a very important story to tell. And the reason why we're here today, there is a powerful reset that we can deploy when the next crisis strikes, when the next pandemic threat comes around, to say, one thing we learned is the epidemiological approach we need to take means that we have to have an absolutely bird's eye focused view on saving lives from day one. So by all means, let's have the R&D in vaccines, but we actually have to have the R&D in therapeutics. We also have to look at how to repurpose existing therapeutics. And another criticism that came out, a third point, was that clinical trials were not strategic enough in terms of the therapeutics play. So that's a really important one to get right. I would add a small sub-point as well, and a reminder of the misinformation and disinformation that came up around therapeutics during the COVID crisis. Given that there wasn't as much news around regarding therapeutics and treatments, I think this had an outsized impact on both some misinformation that meant there was a a rush of demand for products that were hailed as unique unicorn solutions that maybe weren't. But there was also the very damaging disinformation that actually was dangerous to people's lives, pointing them in the direction of at-home products for solutions. So what's on the agenda and what's on the horizon regarding the future? Well, since February 2023, there's been a process to look at how we can create a medical countermeasures platform for the future that learns from a lot of these lessons. In terms of the content and what's been discussed there is some positive news in that instead of dividing by issue area and setting up this kind of fake competition between therapeutics and other areas, there's a more integrated approach looking instead at R&D, scalable manufacturing, supply chain, equitable allocation, and integrated delivery. So it's good to see that one of the lessons learned is let's not pit the products against each other. Let's have an integrated strategy for all of them. But actually, where that platform is going depends very much on what happens in the next few weeks with the pandemic agreement and the IHRs. But there is a foundation there, and there is an acknowledgement and a learning that we absolutely have to have a platform that's a connective tissue center where all governments, all manufacturers, all suppliers in the world have a place to go to meet and make deals. But we have to do that on a different basis next time. And I would come back to the importance of the structural inequities we saw during COVID. And the only way to deal with those is to also look very closely at intellectual property laws, to have different laws and different approaches during crisis periods, and to make sure that we don't have those generics coming too late. We have advocacy and communications to make sure we have therapeutics much higher up the agenda, and that we learn all those precious lessons from COVID and turn them into action. Thank you.
Thank you, Eloise. This is so fascinating, and I can already think of 3 questions to ask you immediately, but that is not quite my job yet. Can I introduce our next speaker, Harjot Kossa, who is Regional External Relations Director of International Planned Parenthood Federation and long COVID advocate. You're in Delhi, I think, are you? And Harjot's going to tell us the personal story, particularly of what happened and the lack of vaccine delivery and everything else that happened during the pandemic. And this isn't just an issue of therapeutics, but you can explain. Thank you, Harjot.
Thank you so much, Victoria, and hello, everyone. And of course, I want to talk what happened back then, but now also, like just 15 days ago, I got my lung X-ray done, and I still have these black patches. So my lungs have it forever. And every time there's a viral infection or anything, and I'm so scared that, oh my God, I've got COVID again. So it's not over. And we have to say that the things that we missed, the points that just Eloise highlighted, they are still continuing. There is still access issues, there's still barriers. And what are we talking about? Like, what is happening to people or communities who were vaccinated? I am still on blood thinners. Like every time I get breathing issues and, my partner gets worried and, again, I'm put on PCM and blood thinners. I have access, but what about everyone? We have to talk about long COVID. We are not talking enough about it. And I have access, but what about what about communities? I want to highlight one thing, that people from sex work communities, people from trans communities, many of them don't have their citizenship cards. In every country there is one. So a lot of them still don't have been vaccinated. You have to go and look as how politically or how government took the vaccination programs, reaching the last miles, and still people who don't have citizenship cards, they have no right to get vaccinated in the country. you know. So that is what we are still living in. And I'm also talking about countries in South Asia, like Bangladesh. Okay, COVID, in entire South Asia, January 2021, we were ready with vaccines. But under COVAX, Bangladesh got it in July 22 for larger communities. Till that time, they were waiting, India was manufacturing a lot of vaccines and it was going to other countries, still people were not vaccinated. I think that commitment from manufacturers is also something that was missing. And I think now for future pandemics and right now, we want that commitment to be more strengthened. That is also one area. We talk about single male migrants from Maldives, last one to be vaccinated because they are undocumented. They are not even a citizen of a country. And I think no one is talking about people from fragile settings, humanitarian settings. Afghanistan, Taliban regime started in Afghanistan. So there was literally no discussion on getting people tested for COVID. Vaccination was a far-flung thought, So we missed lot of opportunities. We failed for so many communities when it comes to COVID therapeutics and vaccination. For future pandemics, I think we have to have a holistic perspective as to how we begin planning for it. I want to tell you that I got COVID in the second wave. I live in a hospital. My partner is a medical doctor. My house is walking distance from the emergency ward. On the 8th day of the infection, after testing positive for COVID, which I thought that the 8th day was my last day, I had no access to a bed in the emergency. I had no access to an oxygen cylinder. I was unable to even breathe at that time. And can you imagine? Oh, I just don't want to remember that day now. So what I'm trying to say is I got vaccinated, but I got vaccinated so late because I was not in a priority list of my country. I got vaccinated after getting COVID infection, despite vaccinations rolled out in January, but government was prioritizing and many of the people were getting because they were not vaccinated. I am diabetic. Still, I was unable to get vaccination on time. So the discussion then comes on to the health system. How resilient are our health systems? How much are we still prepared for future? Another pandemic hit and oh my God, our health systems are going to, So I live in a hospital. I saw, HIV treatment centers, TB centers closed. Nobody, what about the other, diseases? I think everything just stopped when the pandemic hit. Are we ready for another pandemic or another thing to tell us what is the importance of having a resilient health system, or if there are vaccinations, getting them on time, or what are the therapeutics? Are we able to put therapeutics in hands of communities? Are the communities well prepared, well capacitated? Are we ready for it? I don't think so. We are not at all ready for it. We are, and now when the negotiations are happening, I think this is the time we need more commitment, like I said, from manufacturers, governments, more activists need to come out, more solidarity has to happen. Otherwise, we are ready to fail again. Yeah, that's about my perspective. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you very much. We're already getting some comments into the chat and some questions. And journalists, please, if you want to ask some questions, just put them into the Q&A and or chat and or raise your hand, and hopefully I will be able to see that. And I'm sorry for what you've gone through, Hajat. That it sounds dreadful, and I think a lot of people think COVID's just gone away. It's all over and done with, but we know that the millions and millions who are still suffering, like you. Can I move on now to Shingai Machingaitsa, who is co-chair the Science and Technology Expert Group and International Pandemic Preparedness Secretariat, the IPPS, and Shingai is going to be talking about a review of that roadmap and scorecard and making the case again, which we're already beginning to hear quite strongly from our panel, for a global coordination around therapeutics. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for that kind introduction. So I think I'll start by giving a little bit of background on the 100 Days mission, which I think many of you are familiar with. In 2021, G7 and G20 leaders agreed that the first 100 days of any outbreak are crucial to determining its course and bringing it under control, which of course is only possible with the right measures in place. They commissioned a group of experts who developed a set of recommendations drawing from lessons that were learned from COVID-19, setting out what it would take to be better prepared in the event of the next pandemic, to have tests, to have treatments, to have vaccines approved and ready for rollout within 100 days. This report was welcomed by the G7 leaders, and the concept of the 100-day mission was subsequently also endorsed by the G20 leaders. So, known as the 100-day mission, the initiative aims to focus attention on efficiently and equitably preparing for future outbreaks, by considering timelines to developing vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics. The 100-day mission recognizes that each tool has a role to play, and having all the countermeasures at optimal capacity is crucial to achieve this 100-day mission. There are three high-level objectives. The first being investing in R&D to fill the gaps in diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. Secondly, making the exceptional routine by embedding best practice between pandemics. And lastly, agreeing in advance on the rules of the road to govern critical decisions such as financing, procurement, and sample sharing during a pandemic. So that's a bit about the background of where the 100-day mission originates. Where are we now in 2024? So each year we publish an implementation report. So in January 2023, the IPPS published the third implementation report and also published a therapeutics roadmap. Now, the implementation report highlighted some key gaps, that there were investment gaps, particularly significant underinvestment in the development of therapeutics when compared to vaccines and diagnostics. I think my co-panelists have also highlighted this. There are development challenges that are relating to the development pipeline for therapeutics with multiple hurdles, including long development timelines, regulatory challenges, and the need for robust clinical trial infrastructure globally. Thirdly, equitable access, which has just been highlighted. Ensuring equitable access to therapeutics remains a challenge, particularly for low and middle income countries. And there are no current strategies that sufficiently address the needs of these regions. And lastly, collaborative efforts. It is important for global and regional partnerships to emphasize and enhance the therapeutic readiness and ensure coordinated efforts during pandemics. So in response to the findings of this implementation roadmap, which were published, the therapeutics roadmap, which was developed by a multi-sectoral group of partners, sought to set out a framework to achieve several objectives focused with bridging the gap within the therapeutics arena. And so the objectives were set out to develop at least 25 phase 2 ready therapeutic candidates, to optimize monoclonal antibodies with equitable access in mind, and to map out the most efficient regulatory pathway to make sure that these candidates are safe, effective, and able to be rolled out in a pandemic as quickly as possible. The key recommendation of this therapeutics roadmap was that an end-to-end therapeutics coalition be established to bring the ecosystem together to revitalize the therapeutics pipeline. And this really was because there is no global initiative entity that currently exists that is focused on therapeutics. And so this was the key recommendation. And so the IPPS has been working towards how to implement this recommendation and actually establish a global therapeutics coalition. So moving on now to speak a little bit more about this coalition and what it may look like. This would be the last part of my points. Without leadership and coordination, there's dual risk of duplication and wasted resources on the one hand, and neglect and a narrow pipeline of drugs that do not cover the breadth and potential of the pandemic risks on the other hand. And so, as I said, this is why the recommendation to establish this coalition was made. The idea is that a true therapeutics coalition will bring together key existing stakeholders in the therapeutics landscape across the end-to-end therapeutics value chain, leveraging on current efforts and identifying synergies across participating stakeholders. I think it's important to highlight that the intention is not to create a new entity. It's really to bring together the existing entities that all have different roles, but work together in a coordinated way to follow and achieve set out objectives. So the main objectives of the coalition are to ensure sustained R&D funding throughout the development lifecycle, to develop at least phase 2 ready therapeutic candidates against individual viral pathogen families of greatest pandemic potential. And ideally, this will be aligned with the WHO priority viral family list, so that there are a minimum of 2 differentiated candidates per WHO priority viral family. Then also to develop scientifically rigorous and validated programmable platforms or technologies that can help to speed up the availability of new or existing therapeutics. The coalition itself is expected to bring together partners under a shared framework to better coordinate efforts and create linkages that currently do not exist. And its scope will include both pandemic and endemic pathogens. The focus will be on viral threats to begin with, and not including bacterial or fungal, and will have an emphasis on the development of novel antivirals for priority diseases. And lastly, targeting access to other therapeutics for adequate clinical management, including smart repositioning of current tools. So I think that is in essence what is envisioned for the therapeutics coalition. And a first key step towards this building this therapeutics coalition is that we will be hosting a workshop that is geared to bring a wide range of stakeholders to seek broader perspectives on the potential functions, structures, and deliverables of such a coalition. And we plan to host this on the 24th of June. So I think that gives a summary of the work that the IPPS is driving. I'll stop here for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shingai. And this moves beautifully on to Sharon Lewin, who is, as I said earlier, director of the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity and director of the coming Global Center for Pandemic Therapeutics. And Sharon will explain more about what the plan is there, and also, as we've talked here, about the effective and timely delivery of therapeutics, and I think a sort of a two-pronged approach to this. Thank you, Sharon.
Great, thank you, Victoria, and thanks to all our speakers and to all the people online today. You've already heard a lot about the importance of therapeutics for COVID-19, that they came too late, they weren't fantastic drugs, and they weren't equitably available across the world. But I wanted to start by imagining a situation where we have a new pandemic and we can't make a vaccine, or it takes 10 years to make a vaccine, not 1 year. As an example, after 40 years of research for HIV, there is still no HIV vaccine. However, therapeutics, or what I mean here is direct acting antivirals or drugs that stop HIV from replicating, have turned HIV from a death sentence to a chronic manageable disease. And because these drugs also block transmission, they've resulted in dramatic decreases in new infections. So direct acting antivirals can fill a gap. They can be a second layer of protection, or they can actually be the only intervention we have. So we need to really think hard about how we can make them better, make them faster, and make them equitable. So the Cumming Global Centre for Pandemic Therapeutics was established at the Doherty Institute, a joint venture of the University of Melbourne and Royal Melbourne Hospital in Melbourne, Australia, and the centre was launched in September 2022. The centre was made possible by the exceptional generosity of international businessman and philanthropist, Mr. Geoffrey Cumming, who donated $250 million to the Doherty over 20 years. It's actually the biggest philanthropic gift in the history of Australia. The Victorian government has joined as a main supporting partner, initially committing $75 million over 10 years. And the funding is entirely for people and programs, not buildings. I just want to start by saying we're not a drug company, nor do we plan to do what companies already do well. We plan to expand the pipeline for drug companies to ultimately commercialize and implement as new therapeutics. So our goal is to focus on new platform technologies to develop therapeutics at speed for pathogens of pandemic potential. Michelle already made reference to antibodies as a platform, and I think it's a really excellent example. What we mean by platform is that all the technological hitches are first of all ironed out, and then they can be rapidly adapted to a new pathogen, or what's often called a plug and play approach. Our goal is to provide really long-term funding that are on projects that are high risk, but also hope a high reward. And we think we need treatment solutions, not only for pathogens that we know about, but for pathogens that are totally unexpected. And we need to be able to develop those solutions in a much shorter time frame than what's currently possible with our current technologies. I personally think this can be done, but we'll need new science, new ideas, and transformational changes in how we approach therapeutics. So briefly, our focus at the centre is in four main areas. Of course, new platform technologies. These are not currently in the clinic, but what we can imagine in the future. And I'll give you one example of that, and that includes targeting the genetic code of the virus. For most viruses, that's RNA, using gene editing or gene silencing, rather than highly specific drugs. There's a huge advantage here because you just need to know this target sequence of the virus, analogous to how we developed mRNA vaccines. We think we still need a lot of fundamental virology, bacteriology, immunology to identify new targets. And so some examples of areas we're working on are targeting what's called the innate immune system. The innate immune system is like the first responder of the immune system. It's not pathogen specific. You have the similar first response for nearly all viruses, common across viral families, potentially a very attractive target. We are interested in small molecules, but only those that are truly broad spectrum antivirals. And we really have no effective broad spectrum antivirals currently. We need far better broad spectrum antivirals. And we're investing heavily in new technologies that will drive the science, better animal models, organs on a chip that better mimic real life tissue so we don't go down inappropriate paths using cell lines, computational science, AI, imaging, are just a few of the technologies we think are important. We plan to invest 20% of our funding in blue sky research because this is where any transformational future breakthrough will come from. Just look at the mRNA story for vaccines. To date, the centre's awarded over $17 million in funding to 22 teams across the Doherty Institute, the University of Melbourne and Royal Melbourne Hospital. Some key themes of the grants include a focus on respiratory viruses, that's a given, such as influenza and coronavirus, but also paramyxoviruses like Nipah virus and viruses unique to the Asia-Pacific region, and particularly Australia, such as an example, Murray Valley encephalitis, a mosquito-borne disease that has a 30% mortality. We had our first outbreak in Melbourne last year. It was the first time we've seen cases since 1974. this could come back and spread much further than where it currently is. We're investing in gene editing approaches, mRNA technologies for delivery of therapeutics, not vaccines, and creating a suite of microbiome-based biotherapeutics as examples of some of the great ideas being funded. Round 2 of the program was open to external investigators from across the globe and is about to be awarded. I'll end by saying that the condition of the gift from Mr. Cumming was that we should leverage it 5-fold over the first 10 years to ultimately be a $1.5 billion global research centre. Jeff's an economist, not a scientist. He wants to see that the science in this important area truly grows globally. And what he wants to see in 20 years is $1.5 billion of fundamental research activity across the globe. This is what we think we're going to need to ensure that in 10 to 20 years' time, we're never going to be in the same position as we were in January 2020. Thanks very much, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, and we're already getting some questions in. And can I just remind you to say what outlet you're from and who you'd like the question pointed towards. Can I just ask you, Sharon, before we move on from you, how much do you have the conversation with the pharmaceutical companies? At what point? Are you already talking to them about what you're doing and what your expectations of them are, or does that come further down the line?
I think for our focus, which is the pipeline of new discoveries and new technologies, it will come further down the pipeline, but it's absolutely critical to develop a drug. A centre like the Cumming Global Centre for Pandemic Therapeutics, based in an academic institute, absolutely cannot develop a drug without a commercial partnership. So that will come down the line. I, of course, am speaking regularly to many companies around the world for the reasons of just connecting, as we heard earlier, the importance of connecting all of these activities and avoiding duplication. But there's far less investment in the sort of fundamental discovery end from companies because the timeline is long and it's far more high risk. And that's not really what companies do the development really well.
So if I ask the panelists if they want to turn on their cameras again, and I can, so it'd be very nice to see you. And I just wanted to ask also, perhaps Michelle, I could come to you on this. I mean,
and sorry, Victoria, it says I can't put on my video, so it seems like I'm blocked by the host. Okay.
Oh, okay. All right. I don't know what. Oh, there you are. Good.
Okay.
Right. I wanted to ask you, because this is a sort of theme that's come through this, but this garnering international support for therapeutics. We saw, and you've all discussed the inequities of what happened during COVID, but also around the intellectual property rights and the manufacturing, just as we're picking up from really what Sharon is saying that needs to happen. Michelle, how do you garner that international support?
Well, I hope very much that the international community can come together around these key issues. You know, if we don't find a way, we will remain.
But is it just a hope, or are you more optimistic than that?
No, I think at this time it's just a hope, and we do have a few examples. I mentioned this mRNA hub in South Africa, which is operating by itself, which is preparing its own manufacturing its own mRNA vaccines and sharing any technological progress they're achieving with a number of other hubs across the world. So we're seeing, and I think that's the future, a network of platforms and hubs communicating each with the other in a independent way from rigid private property, intellectual property rules that the current system imposes on low and middle income countries. As we speak, the only way to sort of go against the system is to negotiate a tech transfer agreement. And that's really where the negotiations are currently moving in Geneva, so that the owner of a technology shares the technology with someone who will produce the drug or the vaccine. But of course, those discussions occur under an asymmetric context, yes? When one is the powerful who owns the technology and the other is the one who needs it. And low and middle income countries, and particularly the 54 African countries in Geneva, say, we don't want this to continue that way. Because let's be clear, if there was a waiver on intellectual property rights and patents, that would not do it for a complex therapeutic like a monoclonal antibody or a vaccine. Behind an mRNA vaccines, there are 250 patents. Yeah, what we need is technology transfer. And the technology transfer, in order to be fairly negotiated, needs a change in mindset. And I think that can only be reached through some of the successful negotiations and a political approach to these issues in Geneva, or hopefully maybe soon in New York as well. Unless these changes occur, we will continue in the current system.
Thank you, Michelle. We've got a question here from Jerry Hughes, a health journalist from Ireland. He's saying several barriers to setting up the pandemic accord have been mentioned, it seems, and we've just been discussing a bit of this. It seems to me that relinquishing intellectual property is very unpalatable to manufacturers. Has there been any specific strategies suggested to overcome this? And maybe Eloise, I don't know if you wanted to pick up on this, or and then maybe Hajar.
Yeah, thank you. In terms of strategies to overcome these barriers in the pandemic agreement, it's hard to see where the magic will come from in the next 3 days, 10 days, 2-3 weeks. But I think it's important to point out a few things about intellectual property rights which give pause for thought. There hasn't been much flexibility at the international level, but there is research out there to show that even the US government, under different administrations, authorized the non-voluntary use of patents in, I think it was 59 patents in 62 contracts. What that means is governments are willing to open up patent use at a very national level, when they're sort of saying, right, we want you to manufacture something here, I'm going to give you freedom to operate. We need that approach internationally. So I think it's important to understand that, and there's some great work out there by KEI that has opened up that. It's worth looking at. But more broadly, unfortunately, where the debate sits at the moment is still very much what we call the kind of charity frame, which is, instead of a structural approach to these issues, it's, how many doses coming off the production line should be given away to low and middle income countries from high income countries. And there's another kind of complication here. It's really manufacturing countries that hold all the cards. This kind of nexus of companies and countries. It does mean, for example, that even some high income countries, I think the example is Oman, but I would have to check, that was, very rich, but without manufacturing base, putting them in also a difficult issue in terms of access, because sometimes, even if you've got the finance, if you haven't been high enough up in the queue, you don't get the contracts in time. So a couple of issues. There's flexibility in existing rules, but they're not used internationally. So it's important to note that. And yeah, complete intransigence really at the moment to look beyond the sort of charity frame and really how can we give doses away? And what we really need is that support for regional manufacturing hubs, more creativity within the rules we currently have, and frankly, some political leadership on that as well. And last point I'd make is, the unfortunate, I think, backlash of some countries experiencing the positive of having innovations from their country do really well means that they actually want to double down on the kind of nationalistic approach to think, well, if we innovate and protect our homework, we might get the spoils in future. And it's just the wrong way of looking at this issue completely. So we'll see what happens in the pandemic agreement. Whatever comes out the next few days or weeks will be a foundation. But there's a lot of work to do on this area also at the WTO.
Thank you, Eloise. We're getting a lot of questions coming in. We have one from Kerry Cullinan from Health Policy Watch, and I'm not sure who you wanted this to, Kerry, but it's two questions. And actually, can I just encourage people to ask shorter questions because we are going to run out of time. But in this case, we've got, to what extent is pharma involved in initiatives to promote the development of therapeutics, given that vaccines will always yield more profit, which I think is a very good question. And also, we already have an AMR crisis with rising drug-resistant bacteria causing significant deaths. Is this part of the pandemic therapeutics pipeline? I don't know, Sharon, whether you want to take that.
Yeah, I'll start with the first question. I'm not sure it's true that vaccines yield more profit, actually. Vaccines, depending on the technology used, can be made very cheaply, and other entities can make them. Therapeutics can be priced at crazy high prices. Just look at hepatitis C drugs as an example. Very, very high prices. And HIV drugs too, but HIV drugs have a two-tier system where there's generic drugs available to low middle income countries and full price drugs to high income, and now 78% of people living with HIV around the world are on treatment. So I don't know, I think the catch with therapeutics for pathogens of pandemic potential is the significant investment that you need to make, never knowing you're going to have a pandemic from that pathogen. And while we are with small molecule drugs are generally, they're the tablets that you take like Paxlovid or acyclovir for herpes, or your anti-HIV drugs, they're what we call small molecules. They tend to be highly specific for a pathogen. So you can invest all this money in something that may never become a pandemic, which is why we think that platform technologies are so important, because the investment, and I'll use antibodies as an example, the incredible investment that was made to generate the technologies for antibodies for HIV was used for Ebola, was used for RSV, and was used for COVID. It's the same technology. So I don't know. I don't think it's just about profit that the companies don't want to do it. It's because of likelihood of it happening. And of course, there's this likelihood, and it's real, of getting a pathogen that we never even thought about. So Mpox was not on anyone's list of pathogens of pandemic potential. HIV, of course, no one had ever even dreamed that you could develop a virus like that. And coronavirus was at least a family that we'd had experience with, but we may get something totally new. So it's that uncertainty. That's what I think is the reason. And secondly, AMR, absolutely. There is also important. Can AMR can a multi-drug resistant cause a major global pandemic the scale of COVID? I'm not so sure, but it still is a very significant problem. There is a number of entities dealing with AMR therapeutics. I was interested to hear about the 100-day mission not focusing on AMR. In our centre, we will have some focus on AMR, but at a much smaller level, because we think the likelihood of it causing a global pandemic is much smaller than a viral pathogen.
Thank you, Sharon. Harjot, you just wanted to come in on patents.
Yes, yes. So just wanted to add to discussion on the patent. We have some successful stories. I want to bring in that in September 23, pharma giant Johnson and Johnson, they announced that they will no longer enforce their patents for bedaquiline, which is used for treatment of multi-drug resistant TB in 134 low middle income countries. So reaching out with such stories, and we have to push it with the pharma giants. But how this happens, it requires a lot of community level advocacy. The word is citizen science. How much of people who are actually on the road understanding what is the treatment regimen available, what tests they have to get, what therapeutics are available, and why they are not available to them, telling them that why they don't have access, and that pushes the advocacy. And that community advocacy is what led to the successful, of the TB MDR drugs with Johnson and Johnson patents. So we have success stories, but how do we make more? We have to invest, especially when we're talking about LMICs or the global south, or where so much people are there, high population density areas, So that was something that I just wanted to add. Thank you. Thank you, Victoria. Yeah.
Thank you. Did somebody want to pick up on the AMR crisis and whether that's part of the pandemic therapeutics pipeline? Maybe not at this stage. Can I ask, we have a question here from Diana Mendoza, who's a freelance journalist from the Philippines. What is the outlook in therapeutics and coordination and/or support from global medical organizations and more developed nations for low-income and developing countries such as the Philippines, which had the longest lockdown during the pandemic? How do you think developing countries will respond to the next health crisis? I don't know who would like to take that. Maybe Sharon, do you want to come back in on that? And can I encourage you to keep your answers quite succinct, because we're running out of time, annoyingly.
Well, I think it's a complex question. I think what we're trying to achieve with the pandemic treaty is that the response and tools available are equitable in both high and low income, whether it's public health measures, diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccines, all four will be needed. And I think every country is reviewing how they perform in that pandemic and what their needs are. I don't know. I think that's what the pandemic treaty is trying to address, related to that question about the Philippines.
If I can just come in here for a second, I also think that, whatever we reach at global level, what it will be key for the future is building a regional resilience. And we're now seeing regions, and the African continent is one, Latin America to some extent. Asia is complex. There are several Asias, aren't there? But trying to, where all countries are coming together and trying to agree on building a common platform for resilient health systems and self-sufficiency in R&D and manufacturing in the future. It will take time, but I wouldn't say that there is an answer for all low and middle income countries that will be negotiated at the very top political level. The top political level has to set the foundations, and then it's for the regions to make sure that whenever an infectious outbreak occurs in a given region, it is stopped where and when it occurs, preventing that from becoming a global pandemic. And that goes through building regional resilience primarily.
Shingai, did you want to comment on this?
Yes, thanks so much, Victoria. So I agree completely with Sharon and Michelle, but I also just wanted to point out that, equity and inclusion were very strong themes that came out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And, you have to think about how do we ensure that the momentum, the enthusiasm, the push that came from the low and middle income countries during COVID is maintained. Because I do think that, as highlighted by different speakers, it's a very complex and complicated environment, right? It requires a lot of money, a lot of investment, and it's a complex combination of different factors. And so I think what we need is global frameworks that acknowledge these challenges, that set out, a better environment of how we can work together and have better access. But as Michelle said, it really is important to understand what is happening at a regional level in each region. It's not the same. The dynamics are going to be very different. And, you have to be able to see within your region, how do we work better together in order for us to collectively improve our access. So I do think there's a big part that the global players have, that the higher income or developed countries have. But I do think that there's also a responsibility from the lower and middle income countries. What are we doing from our perspectives? How are we prioritizing what we do? How are we investing in ensuring that we're building these capacities, that we are coordinated, that we are leveraging on the existing investments, that any new investments that are coming are keeping all of these issues in mind? So I just thought I would add that. Thanks, Victoria.
Thank you. You've done a very beautiful job of summing up what needs to be, not what needs to be addressed next. But can I just quickly move on? We've only got about 7 minutes now. Kat Lay from The Guardian is asking you, Michelle, for your current assessment of the pandemic accord, she says, looking at the latest drafts of the agreement, is it still worthwhile?
Well, it is worthwhile because, and I think Eloise pointed out to this, it is providing a foundation, but but it's highly unlikely that it will answer all of the challenges that are on the plate. But it will, I think a failure would be really terrible for the multilateral system, for the world of solidarity that we all want to see in the future, for WHO, for the United Nations system. So we need to work very hard until the last minute to get something, probably a framework, just as I remember the Framework Convention for Tobacco took 2, 3, 4 years to negotiate, and then restart from there and go to the most difficult challenges that will require more work. But yes, I think we will have, I do hope very much we will have that sort of founding framework within the next few days. Well,
that's interesting in itself. Now we've got Francisco Joe from Signal TV in the Philippines. He says, thanks for the HIV and COVID analogy. I know some of the speakers already touched on this, but for TV soundbite purposes, Sharon, perhaps we will give this to you. The recent resurgence of COVID-19 cases in Singapore and the Philippines, how important is the push for therapeutics in the bigger scheme of things? How can we make it a priority, like the push for diagnostics and vaccines during the first wave of the pandemic? Why should it be a priority now more than ever? And I think you touched on some of this, but for a soundbite.
Well, I think we learned from COVID that we need therapeutics because the vaccines we developed weren't perfect. The therapeutics came too late. They were too expensive. They weren't widely available, and they weren't great drugs. We need therapeutics even if we have an effective vaccine, as we learned from COVID. But I think the most important thing that we must contemplate is a pandemic where we don't have a vaccine at speed, the vaccine that could take 10 years, or we never have a vaccine. And I feel, and therapeutics in that situation play a really important second layer of protection that can reduce people getting sick, reduce transmission, and potentially protect people from becoming infected.
That's a beautiful soundbite. we TV journalists appreciate that. Sarah Jerving from DevX, Eloise, you mentioned that the medical countermeasures platform is dependent on the negotiations. Can you explain that process and dependency in a bit more depth? And she adds then, in an ideal situation, what type of language would you want to see out of the pandemic treaty in regards to the therapeutics? And how far are we from that ideal language? So I'll come to you, Eloise, and then Michelle, and perhaps quickly bring in to Harjot.
Thank you. So I think, honestly, the relationship is a bit unclear. And I think there's been some political hedging of that negotiation process on the medical countermeasures future platform, not wanting to get ahead of or bounce in any way or be at odds with the ongoing pandemic agreement negotiations. So I think the work on that will ramp up again when there is more of a basis to build on. I think that the challenge that we have is that the issues that Michelle and others have raised around the pathogen access and benefit sharing and some of the IP issues, we'll see what comes out of next week, and we really hope there will be agreement. But it's likely that those issues might actually need further detail and further negotiations. In terms of how far are we from our ideal? Well, honestly, quite far from the ideal. However, I think the thing to focus on now is making sure the pandemic agreement is a floor, not a ceiling, so that whatever comes out of next week is that foundation and doesn't limit future ambition. And that's why when we look at the language on therapeutics, which is bound up with the pathogen access and benefit sharing piece, and bound up with some of the other pieces around what would be the sort of in the next generation Act A, we have to make sure that we have something to build on in the future. And then I think there is a really important role that those negotiations between governments can play at the less formal level in raising that ambition and finding coalitions to go forward to do things in a different way, and open up opportunities, especially around tech transfer, as discussed. Thank you.
Michelle, do you want to just briefly comment on that?
I fully align with what Eloise has just said. I would like to add that if we want whatever will be reached next week to be a flow and not a ceiling, we need political leadership. And this we haven't seen throughout the last 2 years. Yes, remember in HIV we had Kofi Annan, Nelson Mandela, President Bush, President Chirac, whoever. Yeah, there was a group of high-level political people saying the world cannot have the patients in the South and the medicines in the North. That is not the case now. We need to revive that political leadership. Otherwise, I feel there is a high risk of pessimistic outcomes there.
Harjot, we've got 10 seconds.
So I just want to say about political commitments, if Singapore is saying that there is new cases coming and data is, they are putting data out in open, I respect them for doing this. Because one thing in the epidemic countries and political leaders did was not to confirm the data, not to say, oh, it's all hushed and gone. So if some countries are coming out and putting on data, thank you. That's it.
And Shingai, I take it you would agree with that.
I definitely would agree with that.
That's a beautiful 10 seconds. I wish that all the people I interviewed stuck to that as well. But listen, I'm so sorry we've run out of time. I'm sorry to those of you who joined this event and have asked the most fascinating questions. It's greatly appreciated, but particularly to the panel for giving them your time and consideration. And I think there is a lot to to digest, but I keep thinking back to that WHO meeting back there in when the pandemic was first starting and everybody had come into that room in Geneva, how far we seem from that moment and how much better the discussions are already, even if we don't know what the next pandemic is or where it's going to come from or when. Can I just remind everybody there is the chance for one-to-one questions if you need that as well. Can you ask for those via Rebecca and Michael? But just from me to say thank you very much for your time and hope to see you all in person at some point. Thank you.